The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, hope you can hear me. Welcome to the Introduction to Logic Models for CBA with questions and answers. Thank you for registering, and hopefully you'll find the next 90 minutes or so informative and supportive to the development and submission of your operational plan. For those who don't know, I'm Jim Asprey, the ArtPlace Program Manager, and my role today is quite straightforward. It's really just to introduce you to the session and manage the question and answers that we have at 3 intervals during the session. The main presenter today is David Morris from New Economy Manchester, who are one of our delivery associates supporting the ArtPlace program. David is one of our experts on all things CBA and logic models, and I'll shortly be handing him over to David to start the session. Firstly, I thought it would be useful to spend a couple of minutes putting this session into context and highlighting why completion of the ArtPlace logic model has been identified as a key requirement for all areas. As you, I'm sure, are aware, we are currently at the transitional phase of the ArtPlace program as we progress from getting ready to getting going. Some of you will already know the outcome of your Year 2 application, so congratulations if you've been successful, whilst others will be waiting to hear with a final deadline for submissions that was actually yesterday. Having sat in 18 grant panels to date, it is obvious that CBA has been identified, and rightly so, but by nearly all areas as a key element of the operational plan and your proposals for service co-design and reprovision. Many of you have costed in CBA into your 100,000, wishful thinking, into your £10,000 budget for getting going, in addition to also highlighting CBA as the main focus of your 5-day consultancy port. All of this is fantastic. However, the question is it necessary? As program manager, I want to ensure that all operational plans are robust and fit for purpose, and fit for purpose includes having CBA that is appropriate and proportional. And it may be that, you know, what you're proposing is particularly complex and may warrant detailed CBA. However, your proposal may be more straightforward and may require a lot less CBA. So, you know, it's appropriate and proportional CBA are the key words going forward. And today's session is the start of supporting you to identify what CBA is appropriate and proportional for your operational plan. Because what we want to do, we don't want you to be paralysed by fear in relation to what needs to be done by CBA. We want to try and allay your fears and give you assurances and a steer as to what is appropriate for your particular project. Completion of the logic model is the next step, and I'll talk you through the timeline and ongoing support at the end of David's presentation. Throughout, at regular intervals, there will be question and answer session, and indeed we'll initiate a couple of polls which are questions to you to get feedback from yourselves. To ask the questions, there is a section on the right hand of the control panel where you can type in your question. I should add that if there are any questions that we can't answer at this session, we will address outside of the webinar and get back to you. And this session will also support the production of a frequently asked questions document and will be available online during next week. In addition to that, there will be written guidance to support this seminar that will be available on the ArtPlace My Community Rights website from tomorrow. So anything you don't pick up today, the slides and the guidance will be available tomorrow. Okay, then I hope that provides some clarity as to what you can expect over the next 90 minutes and the purpose of today. And so without further introduction, I'll hand you over to David.
Thank you, Jim, and hello everybody. My name's David Morris from New Economy Manchester. Some of you may have met me at the London event back in March or at the recent Our Place events that have been taking place in Bristol, York, Birmingham and other areas. As Jim said, the focus of today is on logic models for cost-benefit analysis. In detail, what we're going to cover is, firstly, what is a logic model? Some of you may have come across them before, but I realise they may be a new concept to others. Secondly, how do you produce a logic model? So how should your partnership go about producing the logic model? And to illustrate that process, we'll be using the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget example. Again, some of you may know what Poplar have been doing over the last 18 months or so, because they were one of the 12 pilot neighbourhood community budgets, which in turn have spawned the larger Our Place project. And then at the end of my slides, I'll just be giving my thoughts on how a good logic model is produced and how having a good logic model can make cost-benefit analysis so much easier when it is required later in the autumn. As Jim said, lots of chances to ask questions. There are a few polls as well, which have been included just to give us a feel for how confident you are about logic models. And do remember that written guidance and further input will be available to you. So don't worry if you don't get everything down today. To start us off then, on the slide in front of you, on your screen, you should see an example of the Our Place logic model. There are lots of different depictions of logic models, and in the written guidance that's going to be available on the My Community Rights site, I've given links to some of those other depictions. This one is a circular logic model, as I'll show you in a minute, but there are also linear logic models. However you depict a logic model, it's basically describing three fundamental steps. The first step, which is up here in this top left-hand box entitled Conditions, is the bit where you describe what is wrong. So what is wrong within our community or within a particular policy area, and what's the evidence for that. I'll talk to you about the detail of that box in a minute, but the second step is where you go down to this bottom left-hand box titled Programme Objectives. So there, what the logic model tells you is, and this is what we will do to correct what is wrong. So you've gone from what is wrong to this is what we're going to do in response. And then the third step, as you'll have worked out, are these two boxes on the right-hand side of the screen, intended outcomes and intended impacts. So those are telling you this is what will be achieved if what we do to solve what is wrong is successful. So you've gone from this is what's wrong, this is what we're going to do, this is what that will achieve. And by going around in that process, you've described a virtuous circle. So by achieving what we set out to do, we'll remove the fact that something's wrong in the first place. Those contextual factors we've identified, they will no longer be there. So I'm going to just describe each of the boxes in a bit more detail to you, because there are obviously questions in there, extra bits of detail that you need. The first box then, entitled Conditions, up here in the top left-hand corner. So what we need to put in this box is firstly evidence of what issues there are within the local area. So often in a logic model in this box you'll see lots of data on things like unemployment rates, rates of ill health, people's views on the cohesion they find within their local community, for instance. When you're putting that data in there, it's always useful to try and look at how that data has changed over time. So is an issue getting worse or better over time, for instance? And you might also want to compare to other areas. So can you show that an issue is particularly prevalent within the area that you're working? So don't just say youth unemployment is a problem, because youth unemployment is a problem nationwide. Put in data which shows that youth unemployment is a particular problem within our neighbourhood or within our community, for instance. Also within this box, you need to give the lay reader an understanding of what are the policies out there that will influence how we respond to this issue that we've identified. So does the local council or health partners or the police, for instance, do they have particular policies or strategies that they're following particular ways of delivering services. At the national level, what are governments saying are their key drivers for responding to this issue? So what are Department of Health saying around the reorganisation of the health system, for instance? What are DWP saying around welfare reform and the impositions this is putting on welfare claimants? So in that box, you need to list the policies which are relevant and pertinent to your work with your rPlace partnership. And then finally in this box, you need to answer this question here. What needs to be in place for change to occur? So to give some examples, do local residents and service providers need to adopt new attitudes to the role of the public sector? If I was reviewing your logic model externally, persuade me that I can't just leave things as they are. Why will current public services as they're designed, or the market as it's sometimes known, why will that not solve the problem? Why do we need a new way of doing things? Why do we need to commission a new approach? Another example might be here around people's understanding, awareness of information. Do we need new ways of informing people about the services that are available to them and how they can engage with them? Have we got evidence that that new way is needed? So that's the conditions box. Don't worry if you haven't got all that down. As I say, I'll talk it through you again with the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget example. Moving on then to how are we going to respond to what is wrong. So in this bottom left-hand corner here, we have 5 boxes. The Programme Objectives box is perhaps the easiest to complete. Most of you probably in your development strategies or as you work on your operational plans, you've probably got 3 or 4 bullet points around your high-level objectives. So what the partnership as a whole is working towards. You often see these in business plans or annual reviews, for instance. And they're really just a distillation of the outcomes that you're seeking to deliver for residents or clients. So you might have 2 or 3 bulleted high-level objectives. Underneath that, you've got a box called Rationale. This is a box which sometimes confuses people. They're not quite sure what the term means. But in simple terms, in this box, you need to answer the question, why have you designed your rPlace program as you have? So what is it about how you're going to deliver services that means that your program will work? So to give an illustration, let's imagine that an rPlace proposal is saying, we've got lots of different teams working within this community. Let's co-locate them in a community centre. And because of doing that, residents will be more aware of where they can get all their service needs. And the service providers will be more aware of who's working with multiple people. They'll be able to design better support. They'll be able to refer people on to better further support. So you go from a disjointed, separate approach to an integrated approach that will deliver better benefits. Another example, let's say that you plan to set up a website to enable people to shape the design of their local services. Now you might say in this rationale box, our reason for doing that is because our research shows that people are currently unaware of how they can influence service design, and they tell us they'd like an online solution. Hence, that's the rationale, that's the approach we've taken. So in that rationale box, think about the process by which you'll be delivering support and explain why you've chosen that approach. Next along, inputs. In this box, you need to list all the funding, staffing, equipment, facilities that you have available to you to deliver your rPlace program. So obviously in the funding there will be hopefully a portion of central grant money, but you might also have match funding from local partners. You might also have in-kind support. So if charities or volunteers are supporting your program, include that resource in here. Don't ignore it just because it hasn't got a value. Make sure you list it down and acknowledge it. So in that box, all the resources you're going to need, and what are you going to spend those resources on, as it were? Well, you're going to spend them on activities. These are the day-to-day things that your partnership will be doing. So it might be setting up a website. It might be arranging training days. It might be hosting community events, for instance. So the daily things that those inputs are going to be used to deliver. That's what you need to list in your activities box. Finally then, the outputs box. So these are the measurable or quantifiable results of your activities. So if my activities, for instance, were to run community events, in the logic model, in my outputs box, I might write 5 community events. So my target for my program is 5 community events, or recruit 50 volunteers, for instance. So it's a simple, measurable output number, a target I can be measured against in future, and I can measure myself against and say, how many volunteers have we recruited to date? Well, we're up to 30, so we're 60% of the way to our output target, for instance. So those are objectives, rationale, inputs, activities, and outputs. And if I was reading your logic model, I'd expect to get to the end of that section and have a good understanding of your nuts and bolts operations. So this is the team, this is the resource they got available to them, this is what they'll be doing on a daily basis. Just to bring us to the end of this slide then, intended outcomes and intended impacts. So remind you, these are the bits where we say, if what we're planning to do is a success, these are the benefits that we will be delivering. So in the intended outcomes box, what you need to write is, if your proposal is a success, then the residents or the organisations or the clients are going to see wider, medium, longer term, however you want to describe it, consequences of your outputs. I'll give an example to make it a bit clearer. Let's say, for instance, that one of your activities was to run 10 health awareness courses, or something like that, for instance. Then the wider and longer term outcome would be an improvement in your residents' or your clients' longer term health. So in the medium term, they take what they learn at those activities, those outputs, and they affect changes within their lives, longer term benefits to them. Another example, if your output target was around those 50 volunteers that I just talked about, then the longer term outcomes within the community would be more people volunteering, more people giving their time to support community activities, for instance. So outcomes, those medium to longer term consequences of your activities and your outputs. The final box then, intended impacts. So this is saying, well, if those outcomes that you've just listed do materialize, then you're going to be having a positive impact upon your wider area. So you might be operating within a ward or within a neighbourhood, but by doing so you'll have a positive impact upon your local authority area or your city, for instance. So to give an example, let's say an Our Place programme generates 50 apprenticeships with local businesses, so that's 50 outputs. The outcome of that might be 40 young people in sustained employment. So they get one of those apprenticeships, but then they manage to keep on to that job and build their careers. And then the impact of those outcomes might be a reduction in the local youth unemployment rate. So there will have been other factors affecting that youth unemployment rate, but the fact that the Our Place programme has helped 40 people into sustained employment, the outcome, means that the Our Place programme has been a contributor to that reduction in the youth unemployment rate more widely. Other examples of impacts, things like lower local hospital admission rates, an increased volunteering rate, a higher percentage of people who say they feel connected to their neighbours. Often people look at these two boxes on the right-hand side of the logic model and they get confused. What's an outcome? What's an impact? That's understandable because the terms are often used rather sloppily and interchangeably, and they're often provided without an accompanying definition. The written guidance provides a bit more detail on this, but what I'd recommend in this webinar is you should see outcomes as the things you will be measuring. So changes for your residents or your clients or your organisations. Impacts are the things that other people will be measuring. So changes in headline statistics that local authorities or health agencies or police forces or national government departments may record and report. So think about it that way. You will be recording outcomes, someone else will be noting changes in impacts. I hope that just explains the difference between them somewhat. I'm just going to move on now to introduce the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget example. Some of you may already know a bit about Poplar from the presentations that Sarah Castro and the team have given, and also the information that's provided in the case study section on My Community Rights. But I'll just talk you through, for those of you who don't know the example, I'll talk you through what they have been doing for the last 18 months. So Poplar is an area in East London, and the target area that the Our Place programme was concerned with were two wards, Bromley by Bow and Mile End East, both within Tower Hamlets, both highly deprived areas. It's a highly ethnically diverse area. There's a large Bangladeshi community, as is indicated on the slide. And the research by the Neighbourhood Community Budget Pilot team found that that community was suffering from some significant health challenges. In particular, they noticed that a large number of people within the community had diabetes or at risk of developing diabetes. And they noticed that a lot of people who did have diabetes were being admitted to hospital as a result of that. So they weren't being able to manage their condition within the community and at home. They were attending hospital. They were unfortunately being admitted to hospital, and they were staying in hospital for longer than average. So there was a case of hospital beds being filled with people with diabetes. There's a statistic there around, over 500 hospital admissions a year related to diabetes. So the team looked at these conditions and said, we've got significant health challenge within this area and within this community. And we also know that there are wider deprivation factors at work here around people not having particularly high-level qualifications, around people struggling to access employment. So in response, and as this slide summarizes, they developed what they call social prescribing. Some of you may have heard of social prescribing. Essentially, it's the theory that if somebody goes to a health professional, like a GP for instance, they shouldn't just be able to receive advice on their health issue. They should be able to receive advice which supports their wider economic and mental well-being. So advice around benefits, housing, employment, community, for instance, all those kind of topics. So in Poplar, what they said is they'd work a team of the housing provider, Poplar Harcar, the local CCG, so that's what the GP groups are now known as, the local authority, the local training provider, and the community in the form of volunteers. They'd all work together to develop what they termed healthcare packages or care packages. What those are essentially is someone with diabetes or at risk of diabetes would visit their GP within Poplar. They'd receive advice around managing their health and healthy eating, healthy living, for instance. But they'd also be paired up with a volunteer who'd then meet with them on a regular basis over the next 12 months to support them to access other services, to maintain the momentum behind their new healthier living, healthier lifestyle, for instance. There was a link, as I mentioned, to the local college, the local further education college, who were based at the Burdett Centre as listed there, and through that they managed to secure places on level 2, level 3, sort of GCSE, A-level type training courses. So if somebody came with an initial health problem but they needed skills development, they could quickly be referred into a relevant training course, for instance. So in a nutshell, that is what the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget was about, and they've been running, as I say, for about 18 months. I'm going to use that example now, Poplar, to populate the logic model template that I just talked to you about. So in front of us we have the blank version of the logic model that Poplar were faced with 18 months ago and you guys are faced with now. We're going to start in the top right-hand corner with intended impacts. One of the interesting things about a logic model is, although it's read from the top left anti-clockwise round to intended impacts, so that's the way you'd read it, it's often easier to complete one by starting at the impacts, so the changes you want to see more generally, and then working back logically and saying, okay, to deliver those headline changes, what differences do we need to see in our residents' lives? What outputs will we need to be funding in order to deliver those changes? How many activities do we need to do on the ground to meet that number of outputs that we've targeted? How do we need to design those activities so people engage with them? Okay, what are the policy context? What's the existing activities in the area we need to be aware of? So mentally, sometimes it's easier to go in reverse and to go clockwise around this logic model, starting at impacts and ending up at conditions. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to start in the intended impacts box, and I'll just talk you through how Poplar went about populating their logic model. So, starting up here with intended impacts, the group who were delivering the pilot neighbourhood community budget, so they sat down and they said, well, we know we have a big problem around the number of people being admitted to hospital and the length of time those people are staying in hospital. So a key impact we want to see is fewer hospital admission rates, fewer hospital admissions, and for those admissions to be shorter. So if somebody unfortunately does have to come into hospital, they at least can return to their home setting more quickly. Linked to that, they wanted to see an improvement in health metrics generally within Tower Hamlets. So the number of people who are taking exercise, the percentage of people who are eating 5 fruit and veg a day, for instance, the percentage of people who are overweight or obese. They'd like to see changes in those metrics. So those were impacts they'd like to see. And then we've also mentioned they thought there were impacts they could deliver around increased skills within the community and increasing the employment rate within the area. Finally, they also said there's an impact here around community satisfaction. We'd like to hear about local people are far more satisfied with the services they get from the health service, from the council, from their housing provider, for instance. So, in the top right-hand box there, you see I've just listed down those headline impacts. I should say at this point, this is a simplification of the Poplar approach. I haven't listed all the impacts, all the outcomes they identified. I just want to give you a flavour of how they went about completing their logic model. So, stepping back from those impacts then, what are the outcomes the Poplar team needed to deliver for their clients, their residents, to deliver those impacts? Well, if you want fewer people to be going to hospital, then you need people to better manage their diabetes. So they need to be more aware of what might trigger a crisis with their condition. They need to be more aware of how to keep their condition under control. If you're going to have better management of diabetes by individuals with diabetes or at risk of diabetes, then hopefully one of the outcomes would be less need for carers. The research have found that quite a lot of households had people, often younger people, looking after members of that family who had diabetes. So the team said, could we free up, as it were, those carers' time, help them to do other things around the community if individuals with diabetes were better managing their care. With improved health metrics, the team were expecting to see reduced usage of the NHS generally, so fewer people going to their GP with coughs or colds or concerns, for instance. They'd be more proactive about their health, and just generally more increased awareness of health issues. So what do we mean by healthy living? How much exercise should you seek to take, for instance? Other outcomes that they identified, obviously if you want to increase the skills profile of a local area, then people need to be gaining qualifications. They need to be getting A-levels, GCSEs, MVQs, for instance. And if you want to increase the employment rate, well, that means that people need to be sustained in employment. So they wanted to help some of the people they engage with through the care packages get a job on a sustained basis, not sort of dipping in and out of employment, but remaining in employment consistently. They talked a lot in this program about volunteering, so the outcomes they'd like to see an increased number of their residents volunteering, and they talked also about community engagement, so higher levels of community engagement with service providers, explaining what the community needs, hearing what services can offer. So I've just pulled up there on the screen, you should see in front of you, the completed intended outcomes box, and you should be able to start to see how the outcomes flow into the impacts. Now, just at this stage, we're going to have a break. Jim is going to be launching onto your screen. It should be a blue page with a poll question on it. The poll question is designed to give us an idea of how many of the rPlace areas have managed to nail down, as it were, your outcomes. So have you had, as a group, a discussion about what outcomes you want to deliver for your residents? And on the screen here, there are just there's a question and 5 possible answers for you to give. Yes, we've got our outcomes agreed and they've been signed off, or yes, but we're still working on them. We still need to finalise them. We've got some of them down, maybe, or it might be no. We haven't started to think about the outcomes we're delivering to residents yet. We're still very much at the high level in terms of what the issues are. So if I just open up my control panel, I can see polls. Jimmy, you okay to launch the poll? Okay, I will. So I have just launched the poll now. You should have that in front of you. So 70% of you have voted, so I'll just keep it open for another 30 seconds or so to allow all of you to vote. Okay, we've got 90% of you. Some of you still thinking about it. %. Right. So a good number of you have voted, so I'll close the poll now. I'm just clicking the close button. And that's interesting then. So looking at your responses, about half of you are telling us in that poll that you have a good idea of the outcomes that your rPlace proposal is targeting. 12% of you saying yep, and they've been signed off. Another third of you just over about to get those signed off. And it's good to see that nearly all the rest of you, 44% of the remainder, about all of the remainder, say you've got some of your outcomes sort of down on paper or agreed and ready to go. So there's only 8% of you saying that you don't know what your outcomes are. That's encouraging to hear. Okay, I will share those results with you. So there you can see those results in front of you now on the screen. So those of you who are in the 12% have got them signed off, great work. But the rest of you, it sounds like you're well on with it as well, which is really encouraging to hear. Okay, I'm just going to now hide that poll result. So we should come back to my screen. Yep. And we're just going to move on now to a chance for you to ask questions. I thought we went, no, sorry if I jumped ahead of myself. Forgive me. No, there should be a question break. I don't know where it's gone. There we go, question break. Apologies for all that. Yep, question break should be in front of you.
Hi, David.
Could you come in and just give me a summary of some of the questions that have been posed so far, if any?
Yeah, certainly. There's a couple of questions which I can answer. To start with, is the completion of the logic model mandatory? It is. We've made a decision that we'd like all areas to complete the logic model, and then, as I say, we can take that as a starting point to being able to support and advise you going forward about what's proportional to your specific project. So completing the logic model will, maybe a half day's exercise, but in doing that, hopefully you'll be saving time moving forward, and you'll be confident from the feedback you get from locality and the rPlace team that what you're proposing to do is proportional and appropriate for your project. So in order to do that and to have consistency and shared expectations, we have decided that all areas should complete the logic model. Another question is around the deadline. We're going to put a deadline of the 1st of September, which is about 6 weeks from now. We appreciate that there is the holidays, etc. for a couple of weeks in August, but we think that 6 weeks is appropriate. Obviously, you have to submit your operational plans in November, so we really don't want to delay it any more than we can. So we can then get back to you by second week in September and give you the green light or give you advice on what CBA is required. A question for you, David, is if an area is tackling more than one theme, say for example young people and health, does that mean they would have to complete more than one logic model?
I think my response to that, Jim, would be it depends on whether those themes are being tackled using fundamentally different activities and inputs. So was it young people and health there, the example?
Yes. Yeah.
So if, for instance, the activities to engage young people were completely different from the activities to promote health or working with an older group around their health, for instance, then it would make sense to have two logic models. Because otherwise you start getting to a point where you get quite cluttered, confused logic models, where it's not clear how the activities link in to the outputs. Because in that example, there might be activities around health promotion, and then in the next box you'd be talking about and young people benefiting in the following ways or whatever. So if the delivery of the two strands is going to be quite separate, then put that down into separate logic models. If, for instance, as with this Poplar example, I know sometimes people look at this and say, oh, it's a bit complex. The way that they were operating, they had that sort of unified healthcare package approach, so a single set of activities, if you like, which could then have multiple outcomes. So advising some people on skills and employment, and they might not have really been that much at risk of diabetes, or they might have been a family member of someone who has diabetes, then also the direct diabetes work. So in that case, I think their program fits together fine within a single logic model.
Okay, couple of more quick questions. Is it necessary to have all partners available in order to complete the logic model?
At the end, we give some tips on completion, and one of those is see it as a collaborative exercise. I don't think that means that you'll have to be sitting around the table to do this. You could have a situation in which one group or one person within a partnership makes a start on the logic model, puts down their understanding, then emails it round to someone else who adds detail, adds layering, for instance. The key thing is to have that collaboration between now and the 1st of September. Whether it's face-to-face, and you could probably thrash through this in a few hours, or whether it's via several email correspondences and it's developed over the course of a few weeks. Either approach, I think, works well.
Okay, and in your experience, David, how long would it take to complete a logic model as a sort of general rule of thumb?
That's a bit of a piece of string question, to be honest, because obviously it depends on the level of detail of the program. If you've got a big national program, it might take you a long time. If it's quite a small, working within one neighborhood or a few streets, it might be quite a quick program. I think, you should be able to get the bones of the logic behind your proposal down in a few hours, I'd suggest. You should have a broad idea of this project, in my understanding, is about this. This is what we're going to be doing. This is why we've designed those activities as we have. And these are some of the policies in format. The key thing that will probably take time early on is just identifying those wider policies. What are governments saying around health policy, or around welfare reform, around education provision, for instance. But the remainder of the logic model shouldn't take too long. Obviously, there's a case then of spending a bit more time refining that, and checking that people have the same understanding of the program's logic that you do, because it's highly likely that people from different backgrounds see your project in different ways. So in the first instance, I think you should be able to make a good start at it in an hour or two.
Okay, thank you. I think that ends the questions for this first session.
Okay then, I will move us back to the example. So where we left it then was with impact and outcomes completed. We now need to fill the bottom left-hand box where we list the nuts and bolts of the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget. So some of you who've been on the training days recently will know that the Poplar team were lucky. They had quite a large contribution from not just the Our Place project and DCLG, but also from Poplar Harcar, their local housing provider. And with that, they knew that they'd be able to deliver about 2,000 of these healthcare packages. So one of their first output that they're going to target was 2,000 care packages per year. They also said around the training, so these are the courses which will help people get into sustained employment and help them improve their skills. They had arranged with the local training provider, the local college, to purchase 300 places on a training course. And they also knew that they had some staff members within the housing provider, Poplar Harcar, who could manage a team of volunteers who would go around supporting people on the care packages. And they set themselves a target of recruiting 50 volunteers per year to support the people that they were working with. So high-level outputs of a project should just be coming through now on your screen. Yeah, there we go. So 2,000 care packages, 300 training courses, recruit 50 volunteers. In terms of the activities, so it should be getting clearer and easier to you to complete this logic model as we go backwards. So the primary activity of Poplar Harcar, the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget rather, was around developing those care packages. So GPs involved with meeting people, identifying their needs, working out responses to those needs, including the wider social needs of the individual. There'd also be day-to-day activities around supporting the volunteers. So not all of them had performed this role previously. Obviously you need some skills to be able to go in to meet someone you don't know and talk to them about their health and about their livelihood and their well-being. So there'd be some support on a daily basis for the volunteers, some training of them, for instance. Obviously there's the running of the training courses. So they were purchased, as it were, these 300 places that they needed to run the courses. And there was quite a lot of publicity and marketing and research activity behind the work. Up front, they did a lot of sort of video surveying on the streets of the two wards, asking people what issues they faced. They also wanted to publicise the fact that training courses were available, explaining to people who were tenants of the social landlord the support that they could get through their GP and through the social prescribing model. So daily activities there, care packages, volunteer support, training, etc. In terms of the inputs needed to deliver those activities, so as I've mentioned, they're in a fortunate position to have quite a lot of financial and manpower resources to devote to this. There was staff from the registered social landlord giving their time. There were dedicated staff within there, but also staff who were giving a portion of their working week to the project. The GPs obviously had to buy into this process. It would take them a little bit longer than it would usually to talk to someone with diabetes and get them into this social prescribing model, because they're not just giving them a health diagnosis, they're also thinking about the wider impacts on their health. There was the volunteers giving their time to support the individuals on the care packages. DWP gave them a small grant around various aspects of welfare reform, and they also got given the use of the community centre. There's a community centre in the middle of the 7 council estates that the project's operating on, and they have the use of that free of charge to deliver activities. So in the inputs box there, just a high-level summary of the resources they brought to bear on the issue. This takes us then to the rationale box. So if you remember, this is a slightly more complex box. It's about why a project has been designed as it has. Firstly, the question that the Poplar team set out to answer was, well, why this area of town hamlets? And they looked at that question and they said, well, all the statistics tell us that there's a higher prevalence of diabetes within this area. So we're right to focus spatially on Mile End East and Bromley by Bow. They also looked at the evidence and said lots of academic literature showing that there are multiple causes of poor health. So it's not just your weight or your exercise, for instance. It's also the quality of your housing. It might be the quality of your family life. It might be whether you're in employment or not. So there are multiple causes of poor health, so a social prescribing model which can pick up all of those and suggest remedies should be more effective. And they also said that by having the volunteer element to the process, you could tailor responses, you could tailor approaches. So it's not a case of going to your GP and being told, well, here's the drug that you can take or not take. You go along and you'd have a tailored solution offered to you. So you can attend this training course, or you can go on these counselling sessions, for instance. And they felt that by tailoring their design, they'd be more likely to have success with people. So it wouldn't just be a case of someone saying, I don't think those drugs suit me or whatever, and stopping taking them. They'd stay the course with the program. So the rationale behind their design, just listed there in the box. The final bit here before we break again for some more questions is around program objectives. So the Poplar Neighbourhood Community Budget team tried to distill down those outcomes and impacts on the right-hand side into some easy-to-understand objectives. So if you're presenting this to someone and said, this is what our project's about, you'd probably present something along these lines. So they said, well, firstly, we can't continue tackling diabetes as we have been doing within Tower Hamlets. It's not cost-effective, and our rates of diabetes are higher than they are in other areas of London, other areas of the country. So a key objective is to develop a more cost-effective way of managing health. They were also keen that they developed a model that could be replicated elsewhere. They realised that they were a small area trying out a new approach with GPs and housing providers, and they said, could we replicate that across the capital and into other parts of England and the UK? And they were also keen to bring communities into the delivery of healthcare support. They felt that previously it had been a sort of highly medicalised area, naturally as you'd expect, highly professionalised, but could we develop a new model where communities have far greater involvement in proactively managing their health and supporting others to manage their health? So I've just summarised some objectives here of the programme up there: care packages with community support, a more cost-effective way of managing health, having a replicable model. So a mixture there of objectives for residents and objectives for the organisation, or sometimes called process objectives. Right, just before we move on to that final conditions box and complete our logic model for Poplar Harcar, there should now be another chance for questions. So, Jim, in that period since we last had a question break, have there been any more questions put by the audience? I think you might be on mute, Jim.
Thank you, David. I was on mute. Yes, there's been a couple of questions that have been quite generic about deadlines and what if some of the key partners aren't available, can there be extensions? I've replied to those, and they're available to all of the participants to have a look at. With respect to specific questions, there was a question about whether they need, at the logic model stage, to be quantifying impacts, outcomes, etc.
That's a really good question. Actually, something that I pick up here in a minute on a slide, but I'll give the answer now anyway. Try to get as many numbers and percentages as possible into your logic models. The reason for doing that, firstly, it gives you as a team a really good feel for, let's be honest, do we actually have the capacity, the wherewithal, the funds to deliver that number of outputs or outcomes? You know, if you look at it and go, oh, actually, we're going to be working with a large number of residents, perhaps you need a plan B, you know, do we need to recruit more people, or do we need to change our focus slightly? Obviously, having numbers in there will help you track your performance over the next few years if you are successful with your application. It will give you ready-made targets to review. And by having numbers in there, things around, you know, whether you're looking at youth unemployment or ill health or levels of community satisfaction, it gives you benchmarks against which to demonstrate how far you've come. So you can say, this is where we were at when we started this process. Now look at the youth unemployment rate, or the number of elderly people who are being released from hospitals sooner, for instance. So it gives you a chance to really shout about your achievements. So yes, get as many numbers as you can in as possible. Obviously, some areas will still be trying to work out those numbers and getting confirmation from partners around the resources that are being offered. In that case, use the logic model to identify, where you don't have numbers. So if you're listing an output and there's not a number against it, that should be, not an alarm bell. That's a bit dramatic, but that should be just something ringing in the back of your mind to say, yeah, let's try and firm that up over these next few weeks, and make sure our operational plan in November is full of numbers and targets.
Okay, and final question is, how simplistic stroke complex do the logic models have to be? This Poplar model seems quite simplistic.
Yep, I have, as I said, boiled the Poplar one down a bit to suit this kind of format in terms of a webinar. I think in terms of complexity, slightly links back to that other point I made around if your RPlace proposal involves working with 2 or more client groups in fundamentally different ways, then produce 2 or more logic models. But if you are working with one client group and you are seeking to get outcomes for them across a range of areas, whether it's skills, whether it's employment, whether it's health, for instance, try and get that into one logic model. The example that comes with the written guidance is set out in A3, so you get a bit more space. But I have seen these and heard of these logic models being done, on A0 paper, or whatever the largest size of paper you can get out of the printer is, for instance, and putting it onto a table. Obviously, you could blow this up. You could do it on a flip chart. You could do it on a whiteboard, and that gives you more space just to get the greater levels of complexity in there. So I'd say try and get sorry to say the right amount of complexity in your model, but don't boil it down to too simple a list of factors, I'd say.
Okay, and then just a couple of requests to finish with. Natasha wants to know if we can have a copy of the more complex Poplar example to see the additional information.
Yep, I'll try and get hold of that from Sarah and the team, yep.
Okay, and finally, Emma's just requested if you could stand a little closer to your mic.
Okay, well, I'm speaking on the phone, so I'll try and lean in.
Okay.
Phone, so I'll lean in a bit. I hope you can all hear me. Okay, thanks for
Thank
those
you.
questions, everybody. So on to the final part of completing the Poplar example. So in terms of the conditions, the local context, so data that showed that things were wrong, the policy context, so what were the health service, local authority, for instance, doing, and what needs to be in place for change to occur. So in terms of what needs to be in place for change to occur, the team thought that the key thing that needed to change was residents moving from seeing the health service as the people who sort out their health for them, to taking a proactive stance of managing their health, watching their weight, watching what they eat, living healthier lifestyles, for instance. So it was about a normative change. Can we get residents to take control of their health? Secondly, it was about giving people and communities and residents the opportunities and the resources to do this, because it's no use just saying, right, it's up to you to manage your health. You need to give them access to, whether it's training courses or information, for instance, opportunities to volunteer. So it was about giving them the opportunities to manage their health proactively. So those were the changes in thinking, change in behaviour that the team were focused on. In terms of the context that they were operating in, most of you are probably aware, obviously, that local agencies are under severe budget pressures. So there was less cash available from the public sector to fund some of this activity. So the volunteer support, for instance, previously that might have been delivered through a housing association staff member or a dedicated officer within the council. those posts are no longer, they don't exist any longer. So there's a need for community to do more for themselves. Obviously within health, there's been big changes recently. So the emergence of clinical commissioning groups or GP groups and their ability to commission support and services from a range of different providers. So not just commissioning, purchasing, as it were, drugs, but being able to purchase things like counselling courses or link in through social prescribing into areas like education and training. So CCG is having a far greater role to play in shaping healthcare services. And then more generally, the things like the health and well-being agenda, health and social care integration. So trying to say, let's move away from, this is Department of Health stuff, moving away from everything being delivered in primary care settings or hospital trusts to more delivery of healthcare support in the community. Trying to get people out of hospital wards and back to their homes as soon as possible to continue their rehabilitation. So those were some of the key policy contexts. And the Poplar team looked at that and they said, well, what we're proposing here is very much in line, it chimes with those developments in policy and what our local partners are doing. Just finally then, so the local context. So in here they put down statistics, information around, and I've put some of these on the initial slide. So the poor health rates within the area, so statistics around numbers of people with diabetes or at risk of diabetes, evidence that that was getting worse or relatively worse compared to other parts of London and the UK. Putting down statistics around deprivation, so how many people within the area are living in what types of housing tenure, how many people are unemployed, looking at skills within the workforce. There are lots of official statistics and websites which are quite easy to find if you Google search them, which can tell you very quickly, you know, here's the profile of the area, the ward, the neighbourhood that you're working in. So they put all those kind of statistics in that first box. So a casual reader could quickly understand that's what Poplar is like in terms of community and the issues it faces. So just finally there, I've completed the box there with those points I've just run through. So the next slide is some tips for getting to a good logic model. Because obviously this is what you'll all be working on for the next 6 weeks or so. And I've just developed these along with Sue Holloway, who some of you might have met from Pro Bono Economics. She's presented at various R-Place activities. And we feel, and I think this is reiterated in the various secondary guidance on producing logic models, which again I've given links to in the written guidance. But one of the key things for producing a good logic model is setting out a good pathway. What we mean by that is, firstly, involve as many stakeholders as possible when developing the logic model. So we had a good question earlier on, you know, do we need to all be sitting around the table or can we do it electronically? I'd say either. Just make sure that as many people as possible have that chance to contribute to the development of the logic model. Because firstly, different people will see your proposal in completely different lights. If they're coming from a health background, it's natural that they'll be thinking about the health needs of your community. If they come from a local authority background, they might be thinking more about child safeguarding issues or adult social care, for instance. So by getting those different perspectives, hopefully should you give you more insight on, actually, yeah, that's what our project's about. It's not just around X, Y, and Z, it's also about these wider issues as well. And from that process, you should be able to get to a common understanding, yeah, as a partnership, this is what we're aiming for. So involve stakeholders. I've talked about that point there about having as many numbers as possible in your logic chain as early as possible, because that will help you when it comes to working out your costs. You can say, okay, we're going to deliver 50 of those or 10 of those. The average cost of one of those is this. And it also gives you a chance to do what we call scenario modeling. So what happens if that number increases by 50% or that number decreases by 50%? How would we as a team respond? Could we recruit more people, or could we profile our resources so we're doing more with a certain group and less with another, for instance? So have numbers in there. And also think about, not necessarily in the logic model, but as a separate exercise in your group, a bit around risks and mitigations. So thinking, what happens if our activities aren't a success and we don't start delivering those outcomes we've listed on the right-hand side of our logic model, what would be our plan B, as it were? So that's some points. Further, once you have your logic model completed, so perhaps before you submit it to Jim and the team, or following that submission if it's still quite a high-level one, you need to check it. So obviously you need to check it, but check it to see if it's plausible. So the logic that you're putting down there, saying this is the problem, this is what we're going to do, this is the outcomes, test that with other people who might be external to your project and say to them, is it clear to you that there's a problem here that needs to be addressed? Or have we just become fixated on something locally which actually can be solved through other provision or other services, or individuals will manage that problem for themselves and we don't need to create a big new architecture? So ask people, is it plausible? Check with yourselves, as I mentioned, is it doable? Once you've got something set down on paper, you should be able to have an honest discussion amongst yourselves and say, do we have the skills, the knowledge, the capacity to deliver that number of outputs and deliver those outcomes? Obviously, think about, is it testable? So if you're going to be delivering a range of outcomes for residents, think, have we got the ability to test whether those residents have achieved those outcomes? So are we planning a resident survey on a regular basis? If those outcomes aren't going to be materializing for several months, it takes a long time perhaps for someone to build up their confidence or their interaction with their neighbours, do we need to be surveying at regular intervals and tracking that outcome over time? So how can we test whether the logic we've set out here is actually holding true? And finally, that point, is it meaningful? So have an honest assessment, linking back to that first point around plausibility. Is what we're seeking to deliver here really worth the amount of time and money and goodwill that we're all going to be investing? Is this a problem that really needs to be tackled, and is this the best way of doing it? So just some points there, and they're expanded upon in the written guidance around how you can get to a good logic model. Some of you, as Jim mentioned, after submitting your logic model, will be asked to undertake cost-benefit analysis of your R-Place proposal. But not all of you will be asked to do this, so don't panic. It's not going to be a requirement of all areas. If you are asked to do cost-benefit analysis, whether that's sort of high-level and quite quick, or a more detailed study of what you're proposing, then having a good logic model will make that process so much easier. So when you come round in sort of September, October, early November time, it'll be so much easier if your logic model is set out as I've described. A logic model can inform CBA in many ways, and I'd suggest that the best way of thinking about it is to consider, well, cost-benefit analysis is about weighing up how much it's going to cost to deliver your program versus the value of the benefits your program will deliver. So on the cost side of that equation, it's quite easy to take boxes from a logic model and work out your total costs. In particular, on the screen I've just brought up there, the boxes around inputs, activities and outputs. These should, if they don't give actual pounds and pence figures for how much you're spending on your activities, how much budget you're getting from partners, they should list activities like, we're going to run 5 community events, or we're going to purchase 50 places on that training course. And those activities and outputs should be quite easy to cost up using simple unit costs. So for those events, for instance, we're going to run 5 events. Okay, we reckon it will cost us £1,000 per event or something like that. So the cost of our scheme in that respect is £5,000. So by having full and enumerated inputs, activities, outputs, it should be quite easy to get to a cost associated with your proposal. On the benefits side of this scales, a slightly more complex process, but if your intended outcomes and your intended impact box are completed, and they say things like more people in sustained employment, improved health, fewer hospital admissions, for instance, there are various models and databases and resources out there which can help you to what's called monetize those outcomes. So turn them from social benefits, so an individual has better health, we can turn that into a pounds and pence figure using these tools that are available. For those of you who are asked to do CBA, don't worry, you'll be put in touch with those tools and those processes. There's more training planned at the end of September. Some of you may have been on the Bristol, the York session in particular, where Julian, my colleague, and I started to introduce those tools as well. So if you've got impacts and outcomes listed, then it should be easy enough for all of us working together to start to turn those into pounds and pence figures. And then that will give you two figures to weigh up and say, yeah, look, our proposal has a positive return on investment. What that means is the value of the benefits are greater than it's going to cost us to run this thing in the first place. So that's how a good logic model will support cost-benefit analysis. That's all that I'm going to talk to in detail today. We've got this final poll here before we go to the last question and the timetable that the locality and team and Jim want you to work to. And the poll here is around, do you now feel ready to complete your logic model? If you've not already started, I can see that Jim has launched that poll on your screen. Just about over half of you now have voted, so that's good to see. I'll just leave it a little bit longer. 2/3 of you have voted, 3/4. Again, nice and quick. You're all obviously still watching your screen and not on the internet or doing something else. It's great to see. So 90% of you, just a few more seconds. Yeah, so good. That's it. 95% nearly of you have voted. And the answers are, so 46% of you are saying, yep, you're ready to complete your logic model independently. And 42% of you are saying, yes, you're ready, but you're going to need a bit of help. I'm guessing there you're referring primarily to, obviously, the relationship managers. But do remember also there's the written guidance available and contact details for Jim's team. Good to see that only, what, 4% of you, so what, that's one or two of you are saying, no, you don't feel that you're confident. Obviously, raise those issues, read the written guidance, still not confident, and come back to us and we can hopefully help you with that. Okay, so I'll close that poll now and I will put the results on the screen for you to see. Okay, so they should be coming up in a second. Share button. There we go. So there are the poll results. Just to confirm to you all that I wasn't just making it up. You have actually gained something from this session. Good to hear. Right. Just before we start then, I had just a few more slides. This slide here describes the timetable for working towards the November deadline. Jim, do you want to say anything to this slide, or do you think it's...
Yes, certainly. I'll just talk through it briefly. Obviously, this is the first seminar. We're running it again on the 25th. As I indicated earlier, we've given a deadline after a lot of consideration of the 1st of September. We're planning to put together a sort of panel of appropriate people, sort of expert panel, to actually look through all of the logic models that are returned. And the purpose of that is to categorize the logic models into 3 categories, 1 being fairly simple, 3 being more complex, and 2 being somewhere in the middle. And we're looking to run that panel in the first week or second week of September latest, so we can get back to you and let you know how we've categorized your logic model, and therefore what level of CBA will be required going forward. To support that, there's also events to follow on from the earlier events we had in Bristol and York in June. There's follow-up events around CBA on the 25th and the 30th of September. Also, you'll have relationship management support for 4 days and consultancy support. We are running this session again next week, not only for other areas, but on the 23rd of this month, we're running it for relationship managers. So relationship managers who don't already have a good understanding of the logic model will be briefed before they and when they meet with you, so they could be they will be a source of support to you around your logic model modelling going forward. In addition to that, obviously in your application for year 2 you've highlighted consultancy support, and as indicated, many of you did put forward 2, 3, 4, 5 days for CBA. Once you've completed your logic model, and once we've gotten back to you with whether you're a 1, 2 or 3, it may be actually that you don't require that level of consultancy support for CBA, and it may be that actually you can maybe look at drawing in consultancy support for other areas to support the development of your operational plan. When your relationship manager is allocated and when they meet with you and have that first session with you, they will talk through your consultancy needs. And then so I'm hoping through all of that you will feel sufficiently supported in not only the production of your logic model but in CBA going forward, and that you can start to see how the logic model links in not only to your cost-benefit analysis but also to your wider operational plan for the reasons that we've discussed and David's gone through today. The deadline for the submission of draft operational plans is the 21st of November for the majority of areas. Some areas who had a later deadline of the 15th of July may be extended through to January, but as it stands that is the deadline for areas to submit their draft operational plan, because then that will lead into the peer review process that will kick off in late November and finish in mid-January. Okay, that's me, David, for the slide. Okay, just to finish off with any final questions. There was one question about the CBA event planned in September. Yes, one of them will be in London. I believe the other one is potentially Liverpool. They're not set in stone yet, but one of them will be in London, to answer that question. I see no other questions at the moment around CBA and logic modelling, so I think that's the end of the questions session. Before I just hand over to David, hopefully you've seen value in today's session, and from the last poll that we sent out, it looks that most of you do feel ready to complete your logic model, which is excellent. So obviously that demonstrates that there is quite a good understanding at this stage of what the logic model is about, and hopefully you can see how going through this process is trying to support you in your CBA and your operational plan, and hopefully you won't view this as just an additional challenge or putting in front of you or more paperwork or administrations that you're required to do, because we are trying to give you as much time as possible just to get on with actually nailing down your operational plan. But we do feel this is an important element that will hopefully support that process and provide that focus at an early stage in supporting the development of your plan. So David, I'll just hand over to you if you have any final comments. No, I think you're on mute, David. So.
Sorry about that. Yep, I was on mute. I was just saying it's my first webinar, and I think that's just demonstrated the fact nicely. Thank you very much for everyone for tuning in, and no doubt I'll see some of you in the flesh at the September event, if not before. So thank you very much. And Jim, are you okay to close down the webinar at your end?
Yes, I'll now close down. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and good luck. Thank you.